Can we just double check that we can hear Francis and Thomas, please? Too late. There we go. It's just us then. Sorry. And is it? And a very warm welcome to Europe House on behalf of the European Parliament Liaison Office here in the United Kingdom and the UCL European Institute. My name is Emma Nelson and it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to know that so many are also of you watching live on YouTube or on Facebook. We know that there's been a really enthusiastic response to our subject this year and it is affecting us all, and so this is a very important discussion. We want to hear from you, so please do have your questions ready after an hour's conversation. The discussion is bringing together academics, lawmakers and civil society to discuss topical issues with a human rights dimension, because this is the first time that the Sakharov debate has taken place outside the European Union's relationship with the United Kingdom. That doesn't mean that the UK and the EU doesn't share common interests and values, and the Sakharov debate is one such interest, as is the Liaison Office's long-standing cooperation with UCL, so many thanks for that. Now, in its 11th year, the Sakharov debate is held to mark the awarding of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. It is named in honour of the Soviet physicist and political dissident Andrei Sakharov. This year, the MEPs have awarded the prize to Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader poisoned by the Russian authorities and currently in a high security camp for his opposition. He will not be in Strasbourg to pick up the award. His daughter Daria Navalny will be there for him. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. The discussion will take place for an hour, and then we'll have a good 30 minutes to give us some time so we can talk about what we've been hearing this last hour. For those who are watching online, thank you. Please feel free to take part. All we need you to do is to put your questions up in the comments section, and then I will be able to see them here on my laptop, and I will be able to pass them on to our speakers. Please keep your masks on if you're one of the speakers, by the way. Now, last year our event was online. Today I'm delighted to say we're in the heart of London, back once again here at Europe House. But similar to last year's subject, which was about health, this year is very, very much rooted in the pandemic. Our discussion today focuses on COVID-19 and intergenerational equity. Now, the idea of intergenerational equity or fairness has been around for decades, but arguably it really took hold after the 2008 financial crash. Here in the United Kingdom, Brexit has stoked the fires of discontent, some might say. And now the pandemic has set generations apart and in some areas at odds with each other. We have, it is reported, an apparently privileged and cushioned older generation who are the most vulnerable to the virus, but accused of hoarding resources, while the pandemic steals the future of the young. But is it as simple as that? We hear of growing numbers of people above pension age living in poverty, and high numbers of vacancies in jobs usually filled by those under 35, such as retail and hospitality. So where are the governments in all this to try and sort this out? Where is the private sector, and what is the role of society? Well, talking to us for the next hour and a half, I'm delighted to say I'm joined on the line from Brussels by Frances Fitzgerald, the MEP and member of the Committee of Women's Rights and Gender Equality at the European Parliament. Sitting next to me, Professor Sir Richard Blundell, who's a Professor of Political Economy at University College London. Welcome, Good to have you with us, Richard. Sitting next to him is Professor Danny Dorling, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Oxford. Thank you for coming, Danny. Good to have you. And joining us on the line in quarantine in Brussels is Thomas Deduy, who's a policy officer at the Intergenerational Justice and Fiscal Policies Policy Department of the European Youth Forum. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me begin. Francis, if I can begin with you, if that's at all possible. For those of us who recognise the word, the expression, but require a little bit of explaining, could you explain to us what exactly intergenerational equity is and outline the current state of play? Big question, but if you could set it out for us.
That's a big question to start with, and I know all of my colleagues will have a lot to say on that as well. Well, it's a phrase actually that we're just beginning to hear much more about. And I think there's quite a few stereotypes around it as well. That's my own view of it. I mean, from the European Parliament point of view, where I represent Dublin City and County, like if you're looking at intergenerational equity now, I think what you would say is, you'd have to begin by saying, what was it like pre-COVID and what is it like now? And the lens through which everything is viewed at present, I would say, and through which we can also view intergenerational equity, which is, I suppose, about opportunities primarily throughout the life cycle. What are those opportunities? But the lens through which we view everything, I would say, in the European Parliament now, I often say it's climate. Think about intergenerational equity in relation to climate. Think about the role that young people have played. Think about development around the world and the communities and countries most at risk. Think about COP recently in Glasgow and what we came up with there. How is that going to impact on the generations and where and how? Then I think about the digital future, and I think about the inequities there, particularly in relation to women and girls, where you have incredible statistics, for example, that show that only 3% of girls across Europe right now have thought about a future in digital by the time they're 30. And we have huge issues about women in STEM. So there's a gender dimension to a lot of intergenerational equity. You mentioned old age poverty. There's a 29% pension gap between women and men across Europe. Think about the impact that will have on older life. Then we look at it also through the lens, obviously, of a post-COVID recovery, and that varies country by country. For example, in Ireland, we've amazing economic statistics coming out now, but that also varies. Then I look at it through the lens of caring, which I'd like to talk about later, Emma, and you look at the needs of children across Europe and what we need to do there, and you look at the elder care and what we've learned from the pandemic, with so many older people dying, with big question marks around institutional care. And yet, do we have the resources? Are we putting the money in to deal with the care challenges, particularly for the older age group as we move forward, an increasing older population in Europe? And of course, the big issues around the role of the state and the economics of the moment. And Europe has never put more money to governments to deal with the pandemic, to businesses, to individuals. And is there equity there? Small businesses have suffered, hospitality and tourism. How do we deal with those inequities going forward? So I'm just painting a very big lens, and I'm sure my colleagues, will look at it through different lens, but it's about opportunities throughout the life cycle, I would say. How have they been impacted by COVID, and how do we plan a future that gives opportunity across the life cycle?
Thank you, Francis. So we have the imbalance of opportunity. Richard, what do you take intergenerational equity to mean? And how much of a position, how much trouble were we in before we started this pandemic?
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, by the way, and this is a really hot topic, and it's great to discuss it. I mean, intergenerational equity, in my mind, is about fairness and justice between generations. And you can think of that as the old and young today, and you can think of it about today and tomorrow's generation. And in a sense, they're the same thing, but they play out rather differently when you come to think of standard of living and how it's affected today, job opportunities, and perhaps the green and environmental debate where we're loading lots of the pain, as it were, on future generations. And as you said, before the pandemic, we'd already had a lot of concerns about inequality. And many of those, in fact, when I was thinking about it, nearly all of them have an intergenerational aspect to them. We were worried particularly about social care and the care of elderly and the way we might fund that and its inequity. We're also worried about the inputs, as we would say as economists, to young people, especially disadvantaged young people, in their schooling. And we were worried about the care of children and how parents would balance their work and childcare. And if you think about it, the pandemic's just opened all of those up to a further degree. The old have clearly suffered much, much more in terms of the actual risk from the pandemic. And that's hit disadvantaged elderly more and some ethnic groups much more. And we could go through the detail of that. But at the same time, at the other end, we've had huge education loss. And I think, to me, going forward, that is still the big issue. We've had enormous withdrawal from education, both in terms of in-school and other access to education, and that's very different by poor and rich. So disadvantaged families and the children of disadvantaged families have had a big drop in their access to education during the two big lockdowns in the UK that we can look at, but right across Europe. If you look at the statistics for Germany, for the Netherlands, and across the Atlantic to the US, you'll see very, very similar things going on. The most disadvantaged children have really had a big drop in their, not just in school, but also online. And that's the disadvantage at home, the inequities of space and education of parents, and that really have played out during this pandemic. And to me, that, rectifying those opportunities going forward is the really big challenge that we're going to have to address. And that's not something that's addressed in the next few months, as there is or isn't a bounce back in the economy. This is a big loss that requires a long program of investments and policies to get that right. It's about providing digital access, and it's about providing a proper program of investment in education for those who've fallen behind. I can go on about other things, but let me focus on that one and leave it there to get the debate going.
Let's bring in, we'll be focusing on education in a while, but let me bring in Thomas here. I mean, you have done extensive research, haven't you, and reports indeed, about the fact that this was a disease that physically hit the elderly, the older, more than the young, but this was a disease which has singled out young people particularly badly in the way that Richard has just described, and also in the world of work.
Yes, thanks, Emma. First, I'm really sorry that I can't be with you today, and thank you very much for extending the invitation to the European Youth Forum. And yes, when we started researching the impact of the pandemic on young people, we had this intuition that as in everything, COVID would be a lens that would show the inequalities that existed before the pandemic, and that's why we focused on four key elements, right? So employment, education, housing, and mental health. And what we did find out, especially on work and income, is that almost 12% of young workers stopped working. More than a quarter of young workers indicated that their income had decreased substantially, and that this impacted marginalized groups disproportionately. For what concerns education, the loss of learning is absolutely is really scary. More than 75% of young people reported learning less during the pandemic, and the figures are even higher when you consider marginalized groups. And all this obviously had an impact on the young's mental health. especially given that although the pandemic and the policy decisions that were taken had a disproportionate impact on young people, there are many shortcomings in a way in the fact that shockingly, you'll find that policies were not targeted towards young people. So less than 1% of all national economic policy targeted youth specifically. There's been a focus on closing schools and university, but a lack of measures to tackle the long-term effects of the loss of learning students are very worried about. So yes, I think one of the biggest lessons of this research that you can find in the report that's been published by the European Youth Forum called Beyond Lockdown, Will There Be a Pandemic Scar on the Young Generation, is that although we have a disproportionate impact of the lockdowns policies on young people, the support during the recovery and has been less targeted towards the young people who actually need it.
Thank you, Thomas. Let me bring in Danny now, because you can kind of come from the point of view of those who are on the other end, let's say, of life, the old, especially the elderly. And this was a pandemic which, it must be accepted, devastated young people in so many different ways. But the older generation didn't escape unscathed either, did they? Not just in terms of physical threat, but there was quite a lot of, big problems for them too.
There were terrible problems of isolation for the elderly. Suddenly finding that your social world had disappeared and you couldn't go out at all. And we must remember that above all else, above poverty, above geography, what really mattered was how old you were. We've lost 6% of our 90-year-olds to this disease. You are 10,000 times more likely to die if you're in your 90s from COVID than if you're a child. 10,000. So that is worth saying. However, I'm partly here because I work with the Intergenerational Foundation. And although this pandemic has had the most terrible effect on the elderly, those elderly were lucky enough to live through some of the best times. Intergenerational differences from my parents' generation, who were children in the 50s, young adults in the 60s, they were disappearing. They were coming together. You could get a home in your 20s. We had full employment. You could start a family. When the 1957 flu pandemic ripped through, we were approaching our most equal. When the 1968 pandemic came, we were robust for it as a society because we were so together. Now, for my generation, we'd split apart due to the 1980s. It was more difficult. If you were better off, you could get a career, you could get a house and so on. If you're worse off, it's harder. For the young people in this room, you're facing the biggest intergenerational inequalities that we've ever measured over how on earth you are going to make it through. It doesn't appear to many of you possible. And then, when this pandemic came, we really didn't think that much about the young. I mean, it was a shock. People didn't know what they were doing. It was for us a new disease, so it is understandable. But in hindsight, we should never have closed schools. And we are seeing the repercussions of having closed schools now, which at one end of the spectrum, the worst end of the spectrum, it's the number of children who have died because they didn't go to school and nobody could spot that they or their families were in trouble. And that's a very visible part of the iceberg. But the rise in mental health, poor mental health amongst children, the fact that in many parts of the country, a tenth are still not coming back to school if they can avoid it, the isolation of university students, and the kind of quiet suffering because you could see what was happening to older generations, so people didn't complain. But this taken for granted attitude, I think, came from the fact that we'd allowed intergenerational differences to grow and grow and grow, so that when something like this happens, because already we were not caring that much about young people. If we were, we would have done a much better job for young people. Because we were not caring that much about young people, we didn't think about the repercussions of the policies that we have done, And now we have a general attitude which is, oh, you're young, it'll all sort itself out some way. Don't worry about the fact that the old have hoarded housing even more than before, as they spread out to villages and the suburbs. Don't worry about the fact that tenants are facing a very high chance of being evicted now, and tenants are mostly younger because they haven't been able to pay the rent. Don't worry about the fact that the job markets have changed, and if you're a university graduate, at least during the pandemic, at certain points you had a worse chance of getting employed than if you weren't, because of course the jobs that we actually needed were people stacking shelves and fixing stuff and keeping society running. All those supposed graduate career jobs, this kind of target where we tell people, don't worry, it'll all be okay for you, they're in those industries which have shrunk, partly because of the pandemic, where you don't need lots of young people in the offices in Canary Wharf because you're not bringing people into Canary Wharf anymore. So I think I'm amazed that there isn't more anger amongst the young, and I think it is going to increase as the pandemic subsides. People are going to finally say, what are you doing for us?
Danny, who do we direct that anger at, though? Because surely within a normal family environment, I have a son and I have an elderly mother, so I kind of get it from both sides, and I'm sure we all have families with whom 99.9% of the time we get on. And there's no way that any of us are going to say, like, come on, hurry up, Grandma, I need your house, you had it really well.
Yes.
I mean, are we artificially setting up a confrontation between the young and old here? I mean, you mentioned, the elderly hoarding houses and the older generations hoarding houses. Is that a deliberate and genuine thing that's happening?
Well, there's partly a hoarding of housing. Older people may stay in a very large house for longer because they want to be able to give their grandchildren a bigger inheritance. It is ridiculous, so that the things that work within a family end up destroying society. I'll look after my family, I'll hoard the wealth, I'll make sure that I pass on inheritances. Inheritance isn't about opportunity. Inheritance is about inbuilt inequality. It makes things more unfair. But this divide within families has been growing. The classic was the Brexit vote, where the grandparents were odds-on voting to leave, often because they thought that leaving was going to help their grandchildren. And the grandchildren, if they're old enough to vote, were voting to stay. We see it in our voting in elections. The 2019 election was all about age. It was age trumped almost everything else. The elderly voted for the government which are currently in power. The young did not. So although we're all going to be polite when we meet our grandparents at Christmas and we'll try and get on, we've split apart in our hopes. And it's not because the grandparents and the old are being nasty. They're making these decisions because they want the future to be better for the young, but especially their young. And the problem is that that's self-destroying. It doesn't help society as a whole.
Francis, let me bring you in here to bring in this imbalance that we're dealing with here. The way that governments have been spending their money and allocating their money, many argue, has been favouring the older generation. I think it was an OECD figure from 2015 saying that governments across the world's wealthier countries spent 2.2 times more on public pensions than on public education. So while we're all getting on in our little bubbles and our families, arguably governments are not doing anything to address this intergenerational equity problem.
Well, they certainly need to do more, as Danny has highlighted. And I'd say it varies across Europe, actually, to some degree. But it's always been an extraordinary fight to get services for children. I've never quite understood it. Even in Ireland, I was a minister responsible for getting an equality clause into our constitution about children. But in terms of childcare services right across Europe, it's been an extraordinary struggle to help families get work-life balance by having high quality, affordable, accessible childcare. We've made progress. The Nordics have made progress probably more than anyone else, France and Germany to some degree, but there's still incredible inequities. So I've never quite understood that because, of course, every society says it cares about children and families. But then when it comes to self-interest, I do take the point that governments look to who's more likely to vote, perhaps, and, where does advantage lie in terms of public policy. And, we've had incredible tax, positive regimes in terms of pensions. So I think the big question about equity in society going forward is absolutely key. I mean, COVID has highlighted all of this in a very stark relief almost. And the question now is, what lessons are we going to take from it? I saw an article recently by an economist who was saying, let's get past, socialism, capitalism. Let's look at international governance and globalization, because so many of the challenges facing us in all of these areas are actually global, particularly, of course, some of the ones we've mentioned. I mean, climate change, digital, and so on. So I think where this brings me as a politician is to the quality of our democracy and citizens' role, citizens' rights. I do think we have moved into an era in many ways that is more citizen-centred. I mean, I've certainly seen that. You have more bridge building between NGOs and government, for example, the influence of NGOs on government, pressure groups. One of the problems, of course, is who are the pressure groups and who is strongest? And Thomas would be in a good position to say, have young people had enough of a voice? And Danny is suggesting that they haven't had. And I tend to agree with that. But I'm not sure the stereotype of young people suffering more than older people is quite accurate. I really do think older people have had an extraordinarily difficult time. Even those whom Danny is referring to as the privileged group. I mean, some of the stereotyping, for example, around language about the elderly, the isolation, the mental health issues as well. For many in bigger houses, there isn't a choice. There isn't enough. I mean, housing now has become one of these central issues. So many of older people do not have an option to move out because we haven't been good at looking at affordable models for single people, for older people. And therefore, you get this hoarding as it has been described.
And Richard, Francis arguably has a point here in terms of the contribution paid by older people in society, especially during the pandemic. We saw informal childcare, care, volunteering, retired medics jabbing arms to try and get things through. There is that. Is there a feeling that actually if older people were perhaps slightly more valued economically and socially, then actually we would be able to lift young people up as well because we were all working towards the same purpose?
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, in a way, you can get a glimmer of optimism out of this, as you were speaking, because in a way we've seen the value of older people, not necessarily from privileged backgrounds, and they've been very helpful in society generally in the way you said, but we've also seen their isolation. And by the way, as the bounce back has happened, it is true that the mental health of older people has been much harder to reverse, as it were, or to bring back. It's something where, as we focus on what's happening now, we can see older, having a much more persistently poor medical health where they have been isolated. The young, as usual, they're obviously very severely hit, but much more, in a sense, able to bounce back to some degree. That's not really true among young mothers, which have still suffered considerably in this. I think that's, many of the things that have happened in the pandemic have shone lights on things that were going wrong. I tend to think, there was really the problem of the disadvantage before, and that's very intergenerational as well. And it's really shone a light on that. We could imagine now, that we've seen the education loss, we've seen the way elder people can help in society, and maybe we might get a kind of new image of what social contract should look like. On the other hand, I thought I'd just throw in the idea, following on from Danny a little bit, that what we've done is put things out of view. Your family, we've moved to a society which is a little more segregated, both within cities and across country. So, you can be in an area with a group of people now, whether it's through social media or your location, where you can almost ignore what's happening to the disadvantaged youth or the disadvantaged elderly. And that's a common phenomenon across many societies, not the UK. The UK is particular. The US is worse, by the way. And I think this is a problem in a way because we're separating off, not just by old and young, but by privilege and area. And that is a new phenomenon in the UK, this geographical separation. And, you know, the left behind kind of areas where the youth in the left behind are really in a difficult situation, but so are the old. The kind of level of services, the level of education there is much, much inferior. And yet, if you're in a privileged part of London, you don't see that. And so I think this seeing point is clouding some of the issues. We don't kind of realise just the level of disadvantage and deprivation and the lack of opportunities that are there for some people. Maybe the pandemic's shining a light back on that, and that's where the hope might be.
Thomas, do you feel as if young people are being physically ignored as well as socially ignored?
Well, no, I wouldn't say we're being ignored. I think it's a very good time for meaningful youth participation, and that this call is being heard in a way. The European Union has declared 2022 to be the year of youth, and I think there's a good reason for that. And it's probably linked to the fact that young people have been affected by the pandemic in a very different way. But you were also asking, about if there's a resentment, some between generations, and I think that's to answer that question. There's a very important point, which is that that was highlighted by the pandemic, that there is a new generation out there, which is the elderly. The older generation is in a way a new one in society in this 21st century, and that different ages, different age ranges, face different challenges and have different needs, and that different generations can provide different things to society, and that's really an important notion, I think. So if we're talking about intergenerational equity, then is the younger generation being treated fairly in comparison to the previous generation? Do we have equivalent opportunity to found families, to buy or rent a place to live? Are the transitions between education and work life as smooth as they once were? I mean, that's a real question. And another generation that we need to include in our thinking is the generation that's not here yet, the future generations. I think the younger generations in Europe are very concerned about the state of the world that they've been provided in a way. And what can we do to make sure that we provide a prosperous future for the ones to come? So that's really the questions that are central here. So I think that if you look at this question with the climate crisis and the pandemic together, you see that all this affects generations differently, and that we should try and mitigate this in a way.
Danny, talk to me about this burden that Thomas just mentioned, the fact that young people have to carry the can, not just for their immediate future, for their security, but in actual fact, especially when it comes to climate change, young people now are not just looking after themselves, but they're looking after future generations here. I mean, that is a huge responsibility to carry, isn't it? Especially when you don't have that much of a seat at the table.
It is large, and I think some of the worst things about it are that young people today have to do things that my generation didn't have to do so much, and certainly my parents' generation didn't, because they had been sorted out, whereas we have made a mess of the last 40 decades, particularly in the UK. Nordic countries have done brilliantly. work-life balance is highest in Finland. Infant mortality rate in the world is lowest in Finland. So let's not forget, Europe actually contains the answer. You just look there. But if you're in an unequal European country, you're going to have to sort it out because the old have actually made it unequal. It didn't happen by accident. This doesn't occur by accident. Right? The old made it unequal, and then they used the language of opportunity to you. We're going to give you the opportunities. The implication being that if you don't make it, well, that's your own fault because we gave you the opportunity. Right? Whenever you hear the word opportunity, just think that, because we've gone beyond the type of opportunity. However, to be optimistic about this and on climate change, there is one thing that went before, which again was my parents' generation. My mum and dad met on a march to Aldermaston to try to prevent a Third World War. That's why I'm here. And so previous generations have dealt with problems which seemed insurmountable. The number of nuclear missiles in the world have now been reduced by 90%. And it was the young who first of all said that nuclear war and thinking you could have one was madness. The old thought they could play this game and have their missiles. But eventually the young convinced the old. In the 80s, Reagan came to a deal and began to dismantle. So if you can do that with the worst weapon that humankind has ever created, I wouldn't be completely pessimistic about the climate change, but learn from the past and previous generations of youth when the old told them that they were naive, simplistic and stupid and they shouldn't worry their little heads about it. Right? At various times in history, the old get things terribly wrong and in various places, and it is for the next generation to sort out.
Francis, in that context, and I'm sure we must express gratitude to Mr. and Mrs. Dorling for not only making you but stopping World War III. But Francis, let's bring us in. The fact is that we have so many young people who have strong voices, who have something to say. But genuinely, how big a part do young people play in the European Union's decision-making process? Do we have youth engagement at every level here, or are we still having a majority where decisions are made for them and about them and without them?
Oh, I would say there's a very long journey ahead in terms of young people's involvement. I don't think it's anywhere near the quantity and quality that it should be at. I think efforts are made. As Thomas said, he works for a youth forum. In Ireland, my own party has, just set up a new youth commission to listen to the voices of young people, to engage. But, it comes back to representation as well, doesn't it? I mean, you're talking about young people. I'll talk to you about, our democracy and the lack of women in it. I mean, we have nowhere near a critical mass of women. Just to this problem is not just about young people. This is also a gendered problem. Let's be very clear. We have very unfinished democracies right across Europe, with some exceptions. But if you ask me, about decision making and a critical mass of women. The European Parliament is the highest with 39% of women. I could diverge totally into this area, Emma. I won't. But the statistics around gender are absolutely incredible. And if you think about the future, involvement in climate change policies, if I look at the UN meetings, I see about 3 women. 8 women spoke at COP at the most senior level, and tens of men. So the voices of women are missing and the voices of young people are missing. So there's a huge journey ahead. And I mean, I see very authoritarian governments taking power now in some member states. I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about the quality of leadership, because if you have very authoritarian structures, they're not particularly interested in citizen engagement, citizen involvement, except in a populist and fake news sort of way. So my answer to your question is that there is a huge journey ahead in terms of engagement in our democracies, of young people, of women, of marginalized communities. I mean, this is something that in many ways we've hardly touched really in our democracies, in the best of democracies. So, I mean, this is an enormous challenge for political parties, and some of our political parties, with their historic roots, tend not to be that great at citizen engagement and to be a little bit suspicious of it. So we've seen citizens' assemblies in Ireland and across the world. Canada's been very good on this. I think New Zealand has done it as well. So I see hope in those areas. And just to go back maybe to the economics for a moment, we have 2 professors involved in this area. There's an interesting point about the amount of money that has been saved, that is in savings across Europe right now during the COVID period. And what are we going to do with that? is that going to be unleashed in consumer spending and rising inflation, which will impact the most vulnerable again? Or can we have government policies that really take some of these issues we're speaking about? I do see Science for Hope as well, by the way, in the way Europe has led on climate change, the way it's leading on digital, and so on. So it's a mixed picture, Emma, you know, but I am an optimist, and I do think there's a lot of potential here, but we better learn the lessons of COVID.
I'm delighted to hear we have some optimism in this debate here. And also, don't worry, in a few minutes' time, I will be opening the floor out. There are plenty of young people in this audience, so that is where you will have your chance to speak out and ask questions. One thing that I was thinking about when I was listening to Francis then is that 2 years ago when we were sitting on these chairs, we were talking about climate rights as human rights. And it was that idea that if you formalise something like climate rights, then actually it will force governments and authorities to do so, and the private sector as well, to do something about it. Richard, is there space here now to make intergenerational equity as almost as a policy objective, or indeed to create a human right?
Yeah, I think I quite... So there's two aspects I can think of here. One is the wealth and savings aspect that was raised. I think that is quite key because it kind of focuses on where a lot of policies have gone wrong, i.e. we're not really redistributing wealth, we're not exploiting, we're not using wealth very well. And, you know, we know that, you know, even kind of not particularly radical thinkers in economics all acknowledge that we tax labour far too much and we tax wealth too little. And in a way, you know, one of the big inequalities that's opened up is wealth inequality and this large amount of saving. So there's something to tap into there, because I think one reflection I would have here is that, you know, you need resources to do the things we're talking about here. And there are a couple of places we're not exploiting them well. One is with wealth. The other is with women, by the way. You know, we're just completely unexploiting the kind of great resource women have just in the economy. And there's some really important calculations that showed, you know, if we could reorganize society and use and have women more involved in the economy, and in society more generally, you'd have a bounce in the economic prosperity as well as, of course, democracy. So those are all there. When it comes to rights, you know, one thing it's been very hard to do is to get a proper rights organisation around climate, and partly the reason for that is that if you think of something like carbon taxes, which, you know, as an economist, I think is an extremely good thing, and we don't do enough of it as it kind of directs people in the right direction. It also, in general, is a very regressive thing. And so many of the policies that we think of in a green agenda and some other agendas don't sit well immediately along with inequality. They sit well with intergenerational inequality, but immediate inequality they don't. And so it's kind of quite hard to get a movement on this longer term thinking while at the same time getting things right in the short term. So I think there's, you know, there are great things sitting there that we could just grab about wealth, taking some of that resource, using it better, about women in society and the economy, and in getting the rights and about and the use of carbon much better organised across generations. But they're all really hard to do. They're really hard nuts to crack. I think that's where we have to go, though, because if you don't have resources, you're never going to get any of this done. One of the big problems I see, you know, the last 10 years is we've had no growth. You know, we have no resources. In the 60s, we had the highest growth rate we've ever seen. And you can do a lot when the economy is growing. But how do we think of that now in a period of worries about climate change and all that? I think it's a better use of resources we have, whether it's women, wealth, or carbon.
I'd agree. I mean, in the 60s and the 50s, we had these very high growth rates. But we also made sure that that growth came through to wages and to young people, rather than being hoarded in wealth. Whereas the little growth we have had in the last 10 years has all been soaked up by people taking it away in wealth. Yeah. And there's an issue of solidarity here amongst the young. And it's very easy for the young to be divided. I think it's the IFS, it's IFS or Resolution Foundation, who produced a report earlier this year showing that if you divide young people into 5 groups, equal fifths, the poorest fifth are going to inherit nothing, the next almost nothing, and so on. But the best of fifth, who are going to get the highest paid jobs, a third of their entire lifetime income will come from inheritance as well. So you lot in the audience, if you were representative of this country, there's a fifth of you who are going to be okay. And there's 4/5 of you who are not. And so we can kind of divide you as a generation because we can tell some of you that, you know, don't worry, that money's coming, that opportunity's coming. And the other 4/5 will tell you, well, we'll give you a chance to go to university and work hard. And it doesn't work. You've got to think about heading back to a society where you weren't relying on the grandparents and the parents to sort you out in future. Okay. Or look at those parts of Europe where inheritance does play a much lower role. And they're also where women do better. Yeah. So the last book I wrote with Veronica is on Finland. You know, and you've got to say 5 women are running Finland, lowest intergenerational differences, least, you know, all these problems, luckily, tend to have roughly the same answer. It would be much harder if they didn't. You get them wrong in unequal countries where men dominate, like Britain, and you get them much better in countries that manage to preserve their equality, where women are more likely to be in power, and the young do far, far better.
Who does it well? You mentioned Finland, but I mean, let's try and we have got a few member states we can deal with here. Yeah. Within the European Union, who are you thinking? Okay, this is where we look.
Well, outside the Nordics, but you've got to face it, they are the best. And interestingly, Finland does better than the others, despite not having as much money, which is useful. But the Netherlands, Germany, and so on things like tenure rights, on you know, how much money will you be giving to a landlord in your life, as opposed to somewhere like the UK. And the differences are less. Again, just take Germany, because we're talking about levelling up in Britain. The European country which levelled up more than any other was Germany after 1989. Yeah. If you want to learn how to make a society more inclusive and how you deal with huge social divides, the Germans did this. It was done, you know, with Merkel in charge for a lot of the period. So this is what I like about Europe and being optimistic. Europe is the best place in the world to actually look at for where things have worked. What upsets me is those parts of Europe where we decide we're not going to look at all, you know, because we know best, despite the fact that our record has been poor. Outside of Europe, you can look at places like Japan, which has done much better than South Korea, and you can say, why is that? And although Korea is very good at producing, Parasite, the film, Squid Games, and so on, so at least the Koreans are sending us constant messages saying, don't be like us. Outside. But this is the great thing about geography, is that we have these separate experiments running in different, and I'm only talking about affluent places in the world, different experiments running in affluent places in the world, which tell us that US policy has bad outcomes, which tell us that in parts of Europe the policies are much better. Why aren't we learning from that? And it's partly because one reason that we get things so wrong in some parts of Europe is because we are so self-confident in ourselves and our own abilities and our own thinking and our brilliant heritage. And we've got to get out of that way of thinking.
Thomas, who does it well in Europe for you in terms of offering opportunity for young people and redressing imbalances?
Well, I think Danny's point was very, very good, actually. And what you see is that the countries that do it well because they've developed plans that focus on young people and that focus on youth employment, on smooth transitions and things like that. If you take the example of the Netherlands developed a national social package that has deliberately focused on youth unemployment and on preventing school dropouts with regards to the pandemic. A very good example as well is Portugal. Portugal has a program called Ativar, where they developed financial support measures to incentivize employers to hire young unemployed people, and specifically young unemployed people from marginalized groups. So the lesson here is what you you get what you sow, right? It's if you want a youth equality or youth equity, then intergenerational equity, sorry, then you need to focus on the young and the young unemployed and the young marginalized people. So I think that's really the lesson. I just wanted to add a small point that there's this amount of wealth that's being accumulating in the elder generations, and I think sadly a reason for that is that the costs for future generations are not really taken into account. The climate crisis, of course, is a great example of this. It's an individual's rational self-interest now to engage in activities that may render the earth uninhabitable or to damage the ecosystem, and you won't pay the costs for it. But the costs will necessarily be paid by someone, and that someone is young people and the future generations that haven't been born yet. So, if you've ever wondered, and I apologize, Ms. Fitzgerald, but why you can take a flight for less than 10 euros with Ryanair now, how can they make it so cheap? Well, the reason for it is the same reason why it's cheaper to buy a new TV than to repair your old TV, is that, future generations are chipping in, and young people are chipping in right now for the real cost of these products and services that are actually much higher than what you're paying for it. So, I mean, if we're serious about intergenerational equity, then we need to find ways to internalize these costs now and to make sure that we're not, hiding some debt somewhere that that our generation and the future ones are going to have to pay for.
Francis, let's bring you on to this one. How much political appetite is there to create a rebalance with intergenerational equity? I mean, we are all looking now into the future of policy and how we fix this. And one place that often we get pointed to is New Zealand, where they have the Living Standard Framework, which doesn't directly address intergenerational equity, but every policy that goes through has to go through a sort of a well-being test. Is it going to be fair on age groups? Is it going to be fair on sexes? Is it going to be fair on different populations from different backgrounds? Why is that being talked about in Brussels at all?
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's all about implementation, isn't it? I mean, as somebody who's looked at the whole equality area over many years, I've seen, for example, in public policy and in government decision-making, an attempt to have an equality lens on every piece of legislation that goes through. I mean, that's really important. Now, it varies enormously, the degree to which that is implemented, but it's a start. If you take the Recovery and Resilience Fund recently, which was, 1.8 trillion, I think, in total, huge amounts to member states, we tried to get an equality lens into that with great difficulty, I have to say. Gender budgeting, great difficulty. It's extraordinary how resistant what has been established can be to getting these new lens. So I think it's hard work. And the same applies to a youth lens, if you like, or a general inequality lens. Societies vary and governments vary, as has been said. I mean, I think, there's no one country, maybe Finland, maybe Norway, the Nordics. I mean, that kind of balance between economic and social. I mean, I think our economic policies have dominated far too much. And I'm in the presence of two economists here, but, we just haven't had that social and economic put together enough in governments. And I think the demands right now of our societies across the globe, absolutely demand that we do that. But I don't think it's easy, because at the end of the day, I mean, you're saying, what are priorities? What are the priorities and how do they get fixed and set by governments? But again, I'd go back to saying, I quoted a recent United Nations Development Human Development Index. It measures countries in terms of wealth, health, education, women's rights, safety and tolerance. That rated Ireland second after Norway on those issues. But there's an article in today's Irish Times saying, nobody wants to look at that good news, actually. And then it's also saying that media are not interested in any of the good news. And therefore, if the good news doesn't get some coverage, maybe we don't learn and incorporate the kind of policies we need enough. So I think some countries are good at doing certain aspects, and, it varies. You could take any one issue. Housing seems to me right across Europe to be one now that unites the generations in many ways, notwithstanding the hoarding point. I mean, just society deciding it's going to provide housing, and where is the money for that going to come from? Young people's, access to housing is very limited at the moment, right across Europe, particularly in urban areas, of course.
Francis, thank you. We'll move on to questions in just a moment, but Richard, you were nodding furiously at that, despite the fact that Francis was suggesting that there were too many of you and not enough geographers.
Yeah. No, by the way, we're in the middle of a huge review on inequality, and we're certainly drawing on other disciplines than economics. And the idea is that you can't solve everything through kind of tax and welfare. In fact, you have to look at society generally. But let me give you one really good example. We've talked a lot about inheritance. It's still the case. Inheritance tax is the most unpopular tax in more or less every country. Sweden's just stopped its wealth tax. So there's no sense that we're going in the right direction, even in the Nordic countries. So it's very hard to tackle these things. When it comes to inheritance, when we think of it, we clearly vote against it as a society. And we don't understand that in a little bit like the Brexit vote. Why didn't we think a bit more about our children and future generations? Surely that's what we should be doing. So there's some puzzles in the way we need to think about how to address policies that we know are going to, even policies we know can fix things are very hard to implement. And that's where Francis' point about, social society, the political science of it, just how do we get across these points and get a kind of popular view? And the final point, learning across countries, we're going backwards in that as well. I felt even during the pandemic, we were relying on our local epidemiology, not the epidemiology that was clearly coming out of Italy at the time. And so we're very inward looking when it comes to policies, policy choices. And that's not just economics, that's generally, and that's something we really have to fight against, because there's so much to learn from across, especially around Europe. It's a phenomenal kind of set of experiments going on. And I think that, that the future for us as researchers and policymakers is to really find where the best is and learn from it.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's move on to some questions. I promised we would throw the floor open. In the meantime, my four panellists, thank you so much for taking part in this first section of the Sakharov debate. What I'm going to get you to do is think about a fix, something which is practical, not something which we can never achieve, but an approach perhaps that we could take. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But let's throw the questions out to the floor. We will have people running around with microphones, socially distancing as much as we can. Could we ask if you could keep your mask on if you're in the room, if you're not speaking, and if you're watching on YouTube and Facebook, just please do send us some questions. I'm getting them through now. I will try and get through them by the end of today's session. But we've been talking enough. So who would like to go first? If you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us who you are. If you want to run across with the microphone, wonderful. And tell us who you are, who you represent, and what your question is, and if it's directed to any one person, who it's directed to.
Yes, so my name is Sam Auger. I'm the Chief Executive of the Third Age Trust. I work with a movement of 450,000 retired people in the United Kingdom. And I've worked with older adults since I was 32, so a long time. I want to make a couple of points quickly. I challenge this them and us situation. Loads of assumptions are made about older people and younger people. We need to get rid of those. It's absolutely possible for people as a movement to do things together. Older people work with younger people. My first programme was an intergenerational programme when I was 32. Older people went to COP. There were U3A people at COP working with younger people. The solution is about bringing generations together. Older people are really keen to do that. On the question of housing, a lot of people have housing because when they go into social care, it's housing that picks up the bill. Their house is what pays for social care. There's inequity around digital. There's an equity about getting to 50 and you can't get a job, but your state pension doesn't come into 67. So my question is, rather than actually put labels on generations, rather than put stereotyping assumptions on generations, how instead do you encourage generations to work together? Because in my experience, they really do. In my experience, you can have huge movements of older people without a huge amount of finance behind that, huge amounts of movements of older people that work already with younger people throughout the United Kingdom. And that is part of the solution, and I haven't heard that in the discussion so far.
Who would you like to direct your question to first?
I'd like to direct it first to Professor Dorling.
Richard.
Danny. Richard, you said Danny Dorling, I think.
So, Danny, yes, let's bring you in. And
Richard, I'm very happy to come in too.
Professor Danny Dorling, the floor is yours. And arguably, the language has been more sort of like warmer from you when it comes to this. You have been talking about old people, sort of like the older generation hoarding, and we have quietly looked at this idea of why are we pitting generations against each other when surely we're all in the same mess.
Well, the problem when it comes to housing is we're not, or we're in opposite messes. So a problem for elderly people is often they can't afford to heat the home, partly because it's so large. And the younger people, they can't afford to rent a home. One person's stereotype is another person's facts, and one person's facts is another person's stereotypes on these issues. But we have separated. We've separated politically. We now vote more differently politically by age than we used to. We used to vote more similarly by social class. Now the divisions have gone the other way. I think your question, your points kind of illustrated the problems. An older generation will say, oh, we're doing our bit, we're caring, but the problem is that the generational divides have risen and got wider while you're doing it, so your solution has not worked. But because people feel that they're doing enough or they're doing something, they think that that's okay, but it simply isn't. I can't see a way in which my children could grow up and live anywhere near where I live, where I grew up. It's now too expensive, it's impossible to do. So I think we have to accept that this generational divide has grown, and it's grown because we haven't fixed it, and it won't be fixed unless we try and fix it in a different way to the ways in which we have been applying so far.
What is that way?
Well, take housing. We're in London, the most expensive part of the UK. London has never had as many bedrooms as it has now per person. We have surplus housing. There's so many bedrooms, forget all the hotels and hostels and everything else, in residential houses in London, that everybody could have their own bed, even if they didn't want to share a bed with anybody else. Right? And it's never been that good. So even if you were to build and build and build, that won't solve your housing problem because the distribution of housing is becoming more unequal, faster than we can build. This is second homes, third homes at some extreme, but it is larger homes with fewer people in. And we can measure this all the way from the 1911 census through, we haven't got 2021 census yet, but the best of 10th of the population have 5 times more rooms per person in the last census than the worst off house 10th of the population. You've got to find a way of encouraging people to downsize. Now, it would be great if we were to build, but we need to build housing without stairs for people to downsize into, near to where they are, because what you do not want to use is your friends when you're old. The Green Party in my home city of Oxford claimed that we didn't need to do any building because the elderly could go to Newcastle, but that really doesn't work because your friends are local. So what building we need is building without stairs that's local to go into. I wouldn't force people out of their homes, but I would encourage them massively to fit into a smaller space. And your tricky one in inheritance tax. You know, you've got to ask, how has inheritance tax become so unpopular when almost none of you are going to pay it? Not far from here is the district, Kensington and Chelsea, with the highest rate of paying inheritance tax in the country. just 12% of people pay inheritance tax in Kensington and Chelsea. Right? This isn't a tax that the vast majority of you pay. People have manipulated you to think that this inheritance tax is a terrible thing on you, and to think that you are going to end up with a lot of money. But as the lady says, you end up spending part of your wealth on old age care or on cruises if you don't need old age care. It goes, you never inherit at the level. So you've got to work out, you're being fooled. You're being fooled, essentially. You're being told you're going to make it, you're going to become rich, you might have to pay inheritance tax, vote against it. But I wouldn't use inheritance tax though, because it's a one-off and it's easy to circumvent. What I would do is a small and annual tax on wealth at a very low level, but then you ramp it up until it has the effect that you want, which is to encourage people to downsize and to get out of their expensive properties. And of course, everybody can afford it because they've got the wealth. The idea that they can't. What you're trying to do is to get us to better fit in our housing. The last one on this, of course, we did have a good way of fitting people into housing in the past. And that's that we had a sizable portion of housing which was social housing, which was allocated on the basis of need, and you were put into a home that fitted you. A London maisonette, mum and dad and 2 kids. That London maisonette has now been sold, right to buy, sold to a private landlord. That private landlord now puts it on the market, it rents it out, and one of you winners, who does well, you'll end up renting that maisonette all on your own. And you'll be going, life's terrible, I have to live in an ex-council maisonette, which used to house 4 people efficiently. Right? And just step back. There's a madness to all of this. Some building is needed. I would mainly build for the elderly population because we've got aging to come and our knees go, which is why you want to get away from the stairs. The amount of housing you can solve by one person moving out of a large family home into something more suitable, the families that can come into there, the young families that can move into their housing, the nicer student accommodation or young person accommodation that you can get, the trickle-down effect is enormous of sorting out housing, but it has to be sorted out, and your policy has to actually get people to be encouraged to move. If you want to pay the higher wealth tax and stay in your very large house in the middle of the city in your very old age, fine, but you need to start to pay for the privilege of that because land and housing is a finite resource.
And Danny, thank you for that. Very briefly, Sam, if we can bring you back in, are you happy with that response? Rush back with the microphone.
I think, I mean, I've made this point so many times in so many forums. I think policymakers and people who are involved in thinking about the future miss that whole civil society, putting it in the hands of helping people actually find solutions. It is really important. Yes, of course, you know, these huge structural changes can potentially happen. You know, governments may change it over time. But in the meantime, while Rome is burning, there is huge amounts that can be done by enabling civil society to act, and I feel that remains a missing opportunity. That is happening everywhere, and actually could be galvanised and eased so much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sam. Right, let me open the floor out to anybody who has a question. There is a gentleman at the back. If you could possibly remove your mask when you speak. Tell us who you are, what you do, and what your question is, and who you are directing your question to, unless it's the whole panel.
Hello, everyone.
It works.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Marcel Moldavski. I'm a natural sciences student at UCL, and as we are talking about inequalities between generations, I wanted to ask you that you've lived your years a bit longer than I. I wanted to ask, I wrote it down. You all have spoken about youth being given opportunities, and opportunities primarily. And we're living on this intergenerational debt. And my question is, has there been any research into what we can do to prevent this influence of this upbringing, let's say, on my generation? So my generation in, let's say, 30 years doesn't do the same mistake. I know what we could do, maybe start considering the issues in 30 years that we would be tackling. And Richard, could you answer?
Oh,
Thank you.
Well,
how can we learn from our mistakes, Richard?
Yeah, we've certainly made a lot of mistakes, and I'm with Danny on on those. By the way, some of the points raised earlier, we just don't deal with housing in at all the right way. I think we could fix a lot of things by looking at social care and the way we don't tax housing at all, by the way. It's really, it's almost a disgrace, and I still don't understand why we don't do this better. We certainly should. I think it's partly in answer to what you're saying. We have we have groups and structures to look forward. We have an infrastructure commission. We don't really do that in other areas where we could be looking forward at, perhaps about social policy going forward, which would have a kind of common purpose, because it would engage people now, but people thinking 30 years ahead. And I think we don't think about infrastructure as the whole structure of society and inequality, indeed. So one could have all that in place. Debt, I think you mentioned debt as well, and of course that's going to be a huge looming issue, I can tell you, across all decisions come the next year or two, because we have enormous debt. But we've been through this before. It's been during a world war. But, the way to think about that is to look very long term at how you solve the debt problem and not let it kind of crunch the things, the policies that you want to do right now. And again, that's a kind of looking forward thing. We have to get the Treasury and the Department for Education and those to look much further forward when they're thinking about their policies, about debt and about tax and about those things. There's a good way, there's good research to show how to do this, and I think we could lift it and use it. But our political system is very short term. Our financial system is very short term. To engage in this common long-term purpose is a really hard thing to do. And I know we, in the European Parliament and in many other groups, we've been thinking how to do that. But I still feel that's the way forward, to kind of think about a common purpose that doesn't set us against each other. And for that, you need to take a long 25, 30-year view of where we're heading.
Richard, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's go online now. Please do put your comments up on YouTube and Facebook. We are getting some in, and it is really, really useful. Francis, this is a question for you, and I think it raises the issue of policy making being made for those in front of us. We try and build the future in our own image in several ways. And it's from Surinder Joshua Durok, who's a former political advisor at the European Parliament. Thank you, Surinder, for your question. They say, why is it most of the minorities that work in the European Parliament are making coffee and working in cleaning? I worked there as a political advisor, and they couldn't get their head around a British Indian third generation working in the building. Offering opportunity for young people isn't just about short-term opportunities, but a sustainable opportunity foundation. MEPs, the European Parliament, why don't you want to discuss the equality factor within your own communities? It brings in the issue of, are you looking at the right people to shape your future policy? Do you have them around you?
Well, I think that's, thank you for the question. I mean, yes, when I look around the European Parliament, it does strike me that we certainly don't have enough diversity. I mean, the questioner is absolutely right about that. I mean, if you look at decision making across many of our countries, actually, you don't have diversity. It's not just the European Parliament. I mean, it's in our governments. Look at government. I mean, look at diversity in government. Look at diversity in the leaders that go to United Nations summits. I mean, it is lacking. I mean, that's a feature. These inequalities are an absolute feature of our society. Now, just to put on a slightly more optimistic hat, I do think the awareness generally in society on these issues, the efforts to be more inclusive, the efforts to be more equal, the efforts around climate change, thinking more long-term, certainly in equality, I do see improvements in gender. But the potential is utterly enormous to increase it. I just want to give you one statistic, taking up a point Richard made, that if you improve gender equality by 2050, you'd boost EU GDP by between 1.95 trillion and 3.15 trillion. I mean, that's just one statistic. And then if you boosted women in STEM and digital, you could give it a 16 billion annual boost. Now, those are the figures on gender. I don't have them on inclusivity across all of the other areas of race, of age, and so on. But I haven't the slightest doubt that you would get those boosts. And let's make the point that if you don't improve our economies, you don't have the money for investment either. Now, one issue, just to diverge ever so slightly, Emma, we haven't talked about the role of business at all, and partnership with business and human rights in business. And for example, trade agreements having more corporate social responsibility and human rights and environmental issues in them. I see that as potential, even linked back to this question. But yes, we have to look at ourselves. Just this week, I was discussing equality in the European Parliament institutions in the FAM committee. And this is a current topic, primarily in relation to gender, but we do need to be more introspective about the institutions and how representative they are. But then you go back to the member states, because it's the member states nominate many of the people who are in the parliaments. But yes, certainly you could be very critical of the lack of diversity. I have to agree with you.
Thank you for that, Frances. Richard, let's bring in the private sector. We haven't talked about them at all. It's almost as if we've decided that business doesn't have to play a role in this, but surely business is absolutely key to ensuring that there is lifelong learning so that people are economically and socially relevant, that young people are trained properly, possibly filling the gap where education might not have missed. Education is relevant because it's got to make people ready for the workplace. I mean, what can the private sector be doing?
Yeah. I mean, generally, the private sector's just got to be at the centre of everything, actually.
Arguably moving faster than governments ever can.
But one big mistake we do with vocational training, and we're learning that bitterly, is that we don't engage employers anywhere near enough. Not just any employers, it's the right employers. We tend to say, let's link up people with some employer or maybe no employer. And in fact, when we look at what makes careers very successful, it's quite a complicated mix of employer, not necessarily private or public. It's the kind of type of thing you're doing, mixed with skills and the way the workplace is organised. That's true for women in work. That's true for ethnic groups. It's particularly true when we kind of look at all the gig economy developments, which generally haven't provided much in the way of good career opportunities, actually. So it's the organisation of the private sector and how it works with employment. And for older people, by the way, there used to be a view that there was cognitive decline with age, and that's just proven to be not correct, certainly up until the age of 70 or so. The reason we have a 60-year-old retirement age in the public sector in the UK is that nearly 100 years ago they did an experiment of when people might not be able to do the kind of calculations needed in government, and they decided to set it at 60. That's 100 years old, and we haven't developed this idea that it's the type of work people are doing that are making them leave work and retire. It's not, and again, that's got to be an engagement with the workplace, with the private sector. On green technologies, by the way, there's a huge success there. There is, the private sector has responded rather more positively than we think in terms of adopting green technologies. So I think it's a matter of doing this in together, and certainly on the training and career structure and lifelong learning side, we're really at the. It's been a word we've talked about a lot, but we're really at the beginning of understanding how to do that well.
It just so happens that we do have a question from the private sector that's come in. It's from Cynthia Hansen. Thank you so much for joining us, Cynthia. She's Managing Director of the Adecco Group Foundation and Social Innovation, and she's on the line in Geneva. And I'll quote it to you, and then I'll ask it to you, Richard, and then to a couple of the other panellists. Her comment is, "I was taken with the idea of the elderly as a new generation in the 21st century. She says, I assume this is based on the fact that in previous centuries, I think you just answered this, lifespans were shorter and therefore we never had to address the needs of older people in the way that we have to do now." Her question is, how can the mechanisms used to identify the needs of young people be applied to meet the needs of older people in a more agile and human-centric way? Maybe you would like to have a go at that, Danny.
I mean, it certainly is growing. So earlier I said about how 6% of our over 90-year-olds have died in the pandemic. But the number of 89-year-olds and 88-year-olds who've turned 90 in the last 2 years is higher than that. So we still have ageing despite this incredible death rate. So we do begin to have to prepare for these very long lives. The young women in the audience are looking at, if we don't muck things up, on average 100. And that requires a different way of thinking. And I think it changes, this question about retirement. Because if you think you're going to live to 100, how long do you really want to work? And my solution to this, and this is possibly sort of one of the optimistic things that a young generation could try to win, there's a campaign at the moment for a 4-day week, that you only have to work for 4 days, you get a 3-day weekend for your whole working life. Now imagine that that's successful, and part of the reason for that campaign is it reduces how much money you get, so you spend less, so you consume less, so we pollute less. That would be part of a kind of win for a young generation, that you wouldn't have to do the 5 days that I did a week or so. But we could sort of taper it. We could let people begin to choose, do they want to do 3 or 4, and so on. And then you can much more gradually move through life stages and finally work out what is this last life stage, because we don't know because it's new. What we do know is that amongst elderly people in Sweden, over a third of them want to live alone. And in Japan, it's the same. I don't like living alone, so I can't understand this. But, we may be facing a future where we are in our own little pods for much of life and in control, but we want to be very near other people's pods and so on. And we tend not to think of that. We really, really run our lives about trying not to think about our old age, certainly not about the end. We don't even mention that at all. We have the care homes we have because we don't think about the care homes we're going to be going into. So a lot needs to be done.
Thank you, Danny. Question, I think it's for the whole panel, but I will focus mostly on Thomas, if this is all right for you. It's from Channing School, from watching on YouTube. Nice to have you with us, thank you. Why not decide by referendum, including 16 and 17-year-olds, on whether the right to vote should be extended to 16 and 7-year-olds? Thomas, what would you say to that? There's lots of nodding in this room.
Well, it's a very old demand from the Youth Forum that we vote at 16. So thank you very much for the question. And if it has to be decided by referendum, maybe that's decided by referendum. But it would be a great way to improve youth engagement into policy making. And actually, I think that also, in a way, answers the very good question that was asked, which is how do we not make the same mistakes? Well, if we want our generation not to make the same mistakes, I think it would be a great thing to include young voices more into policy making and to involve youth in programs and policies that are not specifically focused on youth policy. Youth is a cross-sectorial aspect of all policy-making processes. Young people have opinions and interests in all spheres of life, as all policies have impact and affect their own lives. So mainstreaming youth into all policies and programs sounds like the greatest way to avoid making the mistakes that might have been made by previous generations, I think, going into the future.
Thomas, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to have a quick straw poll, and I know I'm pushing against an open door here, given the kind of faces I'm looking at. Who here would like to have got the vote at 16? Right, Francis, you can't see this at the moment, but I think we know what the result was. I think you've got a bit of an easy hit here. Why aren't you now going to, are you going to go off and campaign for the vote to be extended to 16-year-olds and maybe solve the problems of what the older generation have been doing?
Well, it would be a start, wouldn't it? I think it would be. I've actually supported it myself politically over recent years. We have a citizens' assembly in Ireland who discussed this topic and who said yes. They came up, this is a group of sort of randomly selected citizens, and they supported it. I think politicians are a bit frightened by it, actually, and they're kind of worried. But look, the vote would just be the beginning, actually. It really, all of the issues that we've been discussing about the barriers they'd all still be there. But I think it would be important. People have been I think they've been scared about it, actually, but there's no reason to be. I think it would enliven our democracies. And in fact, that whole first question that was asked about intergenerational contact as opposed to stereotypes that separate us despite the separate issues, I mean, I think that's really important. I mean, I think there's tremendous amount to be gained from generations working together. I mean, just at a personal level, you find it all the time. And, it's the mix of, experience in certain areas and, the way, the lens through which young people view the world now. It's just so critical to bring that to the older generations as well. And by the way, we used to think about, childhood, nearly, adulthood and old age. I think now there's far more categories and far more sort of times, given what Richard is saying about people's, abilities that go far beyond the age we thought of traditionally. You see that, and it's all about the mix. And can I just make one point as well, Emma, to the last question? I think one area that I'm excited about is the European Union now working next year on a European care strategy. And I think that's the beginning of an exciting period ahead to think about care across Europe in a holistic way. Member states will always have to do what member states do in relation to care. But I think there's a lot we can do to develop best practice on care across Europe, share statistics, share different models, best practice, and also work at that issue that has just come up again about work-life balance. I mean, governments are doing more on that with parental leave, with the involvement, of men more in the whole childcare, elder care, and so on. So I think that's an exciting opportunity to do better around the area of care.
Frances, thank you for that. One more question, and then I think we'll be having to wrap up because time has run away from us. I'm going to take it from online, actually, and it builds a little bit on what Frances was saying. It's from Willow Lott, watching on YouTube. Thank you, Willow. Nice to have you with us. There has been a lot of focus on the young and the elderly. Are there any issues being faced by middle-aged people which should be addressed? I know we were talking about intergenerational. There is that age-old adage, isn't it, that grandparents and grandchildren work very well together because they are united by a common enemy. What do we do about the squeezed middle, Richard?
Well, you put it just right. I mean, the pressure on especially middle-aged women, I should add, on both.
Who are you looking at in particular, Richard?
Not where you're going to be.
Thank you.
Where you're going to be, in the sense of having to look after both generations. But I always think of that in a rather positive way. Thinking of the role of older people in the whole child development and looking after children. There are lots of experiments of how best to use older people in schools and in childcare environments where they can be extremely useful and extremely important in child development. So I think, the pressures that we see there, but they're certainly there. We don't have the word midlife crisis for nothing. If you look at depression, being at age 50 is the worst point in your life, or just before 45 to 50. Then you come out of it, actually. So it's a U shape. You're still going there, Emma. But I think so. Yeah. So I take Danny's point. Richard. It can be the worst time. You've got the pressures of work, you've got the pressures of childcare, and you've got the pressures of elderly care. So, but I think you'd put those. That's just bringing the intergenerational thing together, and the fact that we need to look about the whole of people's lifetime.
Thank you very much indeed for that. That's it for questions, I'm afraid. We have run out of time. So, as I promised, a fix from everybody. Let's start with you, Toma. Lead the charge for us. What was the one thing that any, citizen, organisation, government, CEO can take away from this session and maybe put it into practice on Monday morning?
Well, I think a very good idea that could be a focus during the 2022 Year of Youth in the EU would be to start applying to every policy, every legislative proposal that we go through, try to have a youth test in the same way we have an SME test, and measure the impact of these policies, these programs, these processes, with a focus on young people, on younger generations, and really take that that perspective into account, to avoid the disproportionate effects as we've seen in the past years.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Thomas. Danny, what's your fix?
I haven't mentioned it yet, but I think we should look at education taxes and the way we tax young people in some European countries to go to university and the enormous debts they'll have to pay back from that, and ask why are we taxing education rather than taxing wealth? And we should look at educational differences between countries, because this affects young people. And my favourite one is local to the UK, and it's the country you're not allowed to mention. We're just up the road from the Department for Education, is 2 minutes away from here. And the country you can't mention in the Department for Education is Scotland, because it does so many things differently in terms of education, of which my favourite is England expels and permanently expels per head far more pupils from schools than anywhere else I've managed to find in Europe. And being expelled from school is the worst thing that can happen to you. You're ostracised, you can't see your friends, you're made to feel really, really low. And we expel hundreds, if not thousands, every year in England. The number of children that they expel in Scotland per year is 5. Right? So, if you can have those differences within the UK, of course you can behave differently. And what you're told is, oh no, it's impossible. They think differently there. It's not. Incredible change and differences are possible.
Thank you, Danny. Richard?
Well, I'm going to follow. I was going to say, it's the education disadvantage. We have to fix that, the education loss. I think that is the immediate. But I rather like the idea of this building on the success of COP, which does two things. It looks forward and it looks across jurisdictions, countries, and brings people together. And I'd say a COP for education, actually, where we took on, learning across different places with a longer term view of what we're trying to get at there. And in the end, those investments in the young looking forward are our future. And we just don't do enough learning from others and looking further enough. So a COP for education would be my fix.
Brilliant, thank you. You can organise that one. Finally, Francis in Brussels, what would be your fix for today?
Well, I think it has to be care. I'm excited about the possibilities in this. It covers every generation, that sandwich generation as well, because of childcare and then elder care. And I think, working with the social partners and government in the next year to really have our COP on care. We've got to do that. It's absolutely central. And it does deal with a lot of the issues, but it does need more resources. But I think working on this action plan from the Commission on a care strategy for Europe, to me, that's cutting edge and critical.
Thank you very much indeed, Francis. Thank you so much, Francis Fitzgerald, MEP, and also on the Committee of Women's Rights. There goes my pen. Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to Professor Sir Richard Blundell from the Department of Economics at University College London. Thank you so much to Professor Danny Dorling, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Oxford. Thank you to Thomas Deduy, stuck in quarantine in Belgium, Policy Officer from the European Youth Forum. Thank you to all the people who have taken the time and the effort to come out on a very chilly and damp December morning here in London. This debate will be put online, so you can watch this in the future if you've missed any of it or you want to go back to it. It just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed to the team here at Europe House, to the likes of Rena Lynham and Tiffaine Morillon and everybody else involved behind the scenes making this happen. From me, Emma Nelson, thank you. That was the end of the Sakharov debate. Goodbye.